devices and just stream it to the TV. Cool. Let me know if any of the audio seems weird. Cool. Yeah, let's go and read the song. Yeah. Cool. Thanks. He's back.
Exercise.
Oh, okay. There were two. Yeah, let's do this thing. All right, let's do this. I'm just listening.
What's up? What's up?
Cub.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
You're starting.
All right.
Like right now.
Hey, Jack, I'm at the village. Can you go there? Just go to the village. It's just the house right above. Oh, okay. Perfect. All right, that's all. Okay, I'm done. Nope, that's it. All right. We're going to go ahead and get started. Just real quick, how many people have been, is this first time for anybody? Has everyone been here before? Just kind of know the gig, what we're doing. So this is CacheDev, meet every third Thursday. We are looking for a presenter for next month if anyone's interested or if you know anybody. Or even if you have any ideas of something you want. We might be able to figure that out as well. If not, Bill's going to be the backup. So we will have a presentation regardless. So any other announcements? Anything anyone else want to share with the group? All right, I'll go ahead and just get started. As soon as I figure out how to launch a slideshow from a browser in the other tab. Hate how this works. All right. So one of the things I want to do first of all is kind of get a feel for where everyone's at with this. How many of you have ran a server before of any kind? Web server, game server, whatever. How many of you used Docker before? It's about half. And then is everyone pretty familiar with DNS? Who's not familiar with DNS? Do you want me to go over that too? We'll include some DNS. Okay, perfect. So what this is a project. It's really not really a project. It's more like a list of stuff that you can run on your own network, in your house, wherever you want, and it kind of covers a whole range of interests. If you go to this page, let's see which tab this opens in. There's a massive, massive, massive list of things people have curated. They vary in quality, they vary in how well they work together, and all that. This is really just like a list of things people have submitted to run as alternatives for like cloud-hosted stuff. So there's alternatives for Google, like literally your own search engine. There's alternatives for email hosting, photo hosting, media servers, project management stuff, communication stuff, all kinds of stuff. So that's, I'll get this full screen again. Nope. So that's kind of the entry point for me. Is I learned about this and I was like, all right, this seems interesting. I want to kind of play around with some of these, see what I like about this. I came across this other project. So this is compose examples. So these are ones that are specifically set up. They give you an example Docker compose file. If anyone's used Docker, that's basically like a manifest. Lets you run the application without a lot of configuration. So you just download the Docker compose file. So let's say I want to do Homer. It'll have a Docker compose file, and some of them just literally have that. Others might have some documentation, like this one's got a little more documentation. But basically, you put this in, and then you can get up and running real quick. So that's great for testing. So that's why I would highly recommend, if you're going down this rabbit hole, maybe look at something like this to go around, kick the tires, play around with a bunch of things a lot quicker. There's another one. These ones are just made for Docker. Same idea though. They don't necessarily have a compose file already, so a little more setup, but still fairly accessible as long as you understand how Docker works. So what is people's like some of you mentioned maybe you're not that familiar with Docker, but I don't know to what extent. Does anyone here not know what Docker is at all? Okay. So Docker is what's called it uses containers. Are you familiar with like virtual machines? Okay, so think of like a virtual machine. It's basically like a virtual machine. That's the easiest way to think of Docker. It's basically like a virtual machine. So you can run a computer on your computer, and it's independent. It has its own file system. It has like its own networking that it can do, but it's using the host machine's resources. Docker is basically the same, but it uses a concept called containers instead of virtual machines, which are a little more lightweight, more portable. Is that a good description?
Definitely more lightweight. It relies on the machine's kernel, though.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's a little different.
But Docker is supported by most major operating systems, so you're like Linux, Mac, Windows, servers, desktops, whatever. So, okay, so that's what Docker is. These projects basically give you configurations to run your own applications. These applications vary from all kinds of stuff. That's where we're at. I think for the purposes of this, that's mostly what you need to understand about Docker, the details of it. Obviously, if you wanted to use this, you'd want to go through some Docker tutorials, make sure you understand how to run it and all that. I'm not really going to cover that tonight. This is our home network. It's pretty much like an enterprise network, I would say. Probably more advanced than most people have.
Nice.
But the main concepts here that are important to understand for what we're trying to accomplish is we have a firewall here. So we have a hardware firewall. There's a network tap. This lets us do monitoring, alerting kind of stuff so that we can make sure if someone got in, we would know at least. There's a switch that takes care of all the segmenting of all the different devices. We've got all these different virtual VLANs. things segmented and isolated off. And sitting over here in our utility closet, we have two Dell servers.
Because why not?
Because why not?
So I have a question. Your switch, is that a layer 3 switch to understand the VLAN?
Yes, I believe so. So I am not the architect of this.
Oh, okay.
I'm the benefactor of this.
All right.
So I don't know all the details, but this is our setup. And we're going to pick one of these servers, and our goal is to put resources on that server onto the internet, but in a safe way where we're not exposing the rest of our house to the internet, because that's not what you want to do. You definitely don't want to do that.
That is true.
Okay, so any quick questions here? This is like high level what we're looking at.
So why do you have Comcast and Verizon?
We have a failover internet. I have a failover Verizon link if Comcast is being stupid for whatever reason. Like you're in the middle of a Zoom call and your internet craps out.
Yeah.
That's kind of the reason. But yeah, it's like a backup internet. So this is our scenario. We've got the whole internet. We've got our home network. And we need something that can act as our gateway of sorts so that things can come from the internet, go to just the thing we want. That's our objective. So there's lots of ways you could do this. I went with Cloudflare. Is anyone familiar with, or does anyone have experience with Cloudflare? That's about where I was before this. So I'm not an expert at this, but it does what I needed. So the main things it does is it has services for proxying web requests, or really any network request, and then you can decide where that goes. So, and they have free plans, which is all I needed for everything that I'm showing tonight. So everything we did was under the free plans. And these free plans are actually a lot better than like, say, AWS, where you sign up and you don't know where that boundary is, and you might end up with a bill way more than you ever wanted to pay. They seem a little more respectful than that. Like the upgrades were very clear. It's like you default into the free space and you have to opt in to the premium stuff, at least for the stuff I was playing with. So I kind of like that. It's a little more user friendly. If you've never used it before, you're not going to end up with a bill for $10,000 like you might with AWS. Or Azure, yeah. So I think it's a little more, I just want to point out that like these free plans are good enough for what I'm showing here, and at least in the things I played with, there was a clear seam between the paid and the freed things. So we're going to plug that in there, and here's kind of the game plan. They publish a list of their IPs, because they're a fully distributed cloud ecosystem. They do content delivery networks distributed across the entire world. So a request could literally come from anywhere. So these are their IP addresses and the networks that they have. Basically, the last part tells it what network that is. So it's a whole range of IP addresses. There's like thousands of IPs represented by this list. And what we're going to do is we're going to say we trust Cloudflare. I mean, they're used by millions of entities. I think it's good enough for what I need to act as my entrance point to my house. So I'm saying I'm trusting Cloudflare, any of these IPs, and I'm going to designate some ports that we're going to port forward to internal ports on my network, send those to a particular VLAN, particular host on a particular VLAN, allow that through the firewall, and that's how we're going to get to that server in the end. So those aren't the actual ports I use. We're just picking arbitrary random ones that aren't associated with anything, because one of the things about the internet, if you stand anything up for more than two minutes, it seems like, you'll start getting bombarded by bots, especially on standard ports. So picking a non-standard port, even though that is not necessarily security, is highly recommended, because you'll avoid like 90% of the traffic of things looking for things to go wreck. So just pick an arbitrary port, and then your network, you can use what's called port forwarding. Basically, you're remapping those. So the HT port I designated on Cloudflare side, goes to the internal port 80, which is the normal standard one, and then everything on my network can just be set up normal. And then 443, same thing with HTTPS. So does that make sense? That's the entry point into my home network.
Do you have static IP for your network?
No.
No. And so Cloudflare handles that. Like I use it.
Cloudflare does have a dynamic DNS service. We don't use that one, but we do use a dynamic DNS service. Basically, anytime our IP address changes, we report that to an entity that updates a host name, and then everything points to that.
Okay.
And then, so if the IP ever changes, it should change within 5 minutes. It should be, everything should be happy. Does that all make sense? These are the rewrite rules in Cloudflare. They call them origin rules. There's a section under your website. So basically, you're going to, here's the Cloudflare side. So you're going to register a domain. The domain we went with was installation.zip. You're going to set up a Cloudflare account. You're going to move your name servers to Cloudflare. The name servers have to be in Cloudflare. They don't let you do it otherwise. And then we have a dynamic DNS that will point to the IP address. So
Wait, are you saying that Cloudflare
has to have the name
zone
yes.
for installation?
Yes. Because it's doing software rewriting. It does a bunch of non-standard DNS things to make this all work.
Like Anycast, right?
Yeah, probably. But the dynamic mapping. So like, say for example, these are all C names.
Yeah.
I have the self-hosted one, not our actual dynamic DNS address because I don't want to publish my home IP. That's part of the goal of all this, is to hide the home IP, in case that wasn't clear. So I put that in there, and then I point all these REST to that one. So like this guy is like the record that actually points to my home IP. All the rest point to this guy. Now Cloudflare has this thing called flattening for CNAMEs. So internally, it knows where all this is. But anything external, if you check that box and have that setting enabled, I think it's enabled by default, but you can't turn it off. If you turn that checkbox on for any of the proxied records in your name servers in Cloudflare get flattened. So normally you would see all the CNAMEs if you just did this with a normal DNS system. You'd see where all those point, and it'd kind of defeat the purpose because you'd see the endpoint. That would be published somewhere publicly. This way, it's only on Cloudflare's databases, and then they flatten it. And anytime anyone does a DNS query, it's just going to give it the final result, which is a Cloudflare IP.
So I would like to understand, I don't know if you can explain it or if you care to take the time, like why does Cloudflare need the top level domain? Like if you just wanted to run your www through Cloudflare, couldn't you just delegate that?
A lot of this stuff is done dynamically through a lot of their various services. So we'll get into some of that a little bit later. Actually, I have an example of exactly why you want to give that to them.
Okay.
Whereas this maybe doesn't matter as much. It does have the effect of hiding my home IP, and then I can publish the records, not worry about a CNAME accidentally exposing my home IP or something, right? If someone guessed it. CNAMEs aren't public unless you query it. Like they're not published, but if someone queries, like if I just said home.installation.zip or something and pointed that at my home IP, and then someone does a query for that, it'll respond with that. But if you don't know it, most name servers won't publish them. Like you won't get all the CNAMEs automatically unless you request it. Once you request it, though, to resolve it. What Cloudflare does is it flattens all that. So it hides all these details to the public. The public only sees that. You query it, that's all you get. Does that make sense? Did I say something wrong?
Well, what you say about them not being published, my understanding is that any record in a zone, if zone transfer is enabled, which is not the same thing as transferring ownership, like transferring from one registrar to another.
Yes.
It's downloading the database of the zone.
If the
zone
registrar,
transfer is
yes.
enabled on whatever DNS authority you're using, it would give you everything.
That's probably correct.
Okay.
Yeah. Suffice it to say, you don't want to rely on CNAMEs to hide things. So, okay. So this is kind of our setup. I have a virtual machine on an ESXi server. That's that Dell server. The host name, I'm calling it self-hosted. We allocated 1 terabyte of storage for it, 4 CPUs with 4 cores each, and 32 gigs of RAM running Ubuntu 2204. And this is the base setup for everything else. I threw in Homer and Caddy. Those are the first 2 ones that I'd recommend if you're playing around with this to kind of understand how it all fits together. It gives the full loop of everything, at least that I'm going over. So real quick, back to this picture. That first port forward there, sorry, actually I skipped it. This gap right here. So when a user goes to your domain, they're going to just access it in the browser like normal, no extra ports attached. They don't know about that or care about that. So you need kind of like the equivalent of a port forward in Cloudflare. That's where this was the origin rules. I set up one for HTTP, HTTPS. That means incoming 443. We'll go to 6443 to my network. And then my network retranslates it back to 443 internally. Is that kind of making sense? They only give you 10 rules on the free plan. So if you're using a bunch of hosts, you're probably going to hit limits. But for one domain, this is the free plan should work. OK, so once you validated that your CNAMEs aren't leaking something you didn't want, the next test would be to run a Docker container. This is just an Nginx one. I kind of have that wrong because I already had port 80 allocated. That's supposed to be bound to port 80 to match everything else I showed there. But the theory would be you would go to either your local IP or a local host name or your external one with that standing up on the target server, that ESXi server, and then you would actually see that from the internet. Like I could get on my mobile network, not my home network, pull it up with the test.installation.zip host name. That's your first test to make sure this all works. And do that test. I skipped that and wasted a bunch of time with something not set up right. So any questions with that? Does that make sense? So Homer is one of those in the Docker Compose one. So you just go grab one of those Docker Compose files, plop that in wherever you're going to run these from on your local computer, Docker Compose up. Now this will only work on the local one unless you bind it to the port 80 to match your port mapping, which you could do. So test that, and it should look something like this. It's really just like a static page generator. It runs with YAML configuration files, but it's really just like a static site generator. So really simple, not worrying about databases, not worrying about multiple layers of services, just something, make sure it's all working, and that you've got Docker and Docker Compose and all that. So does that make sense? Here's a picture of someone else that uses this. They're using Homer, and these are a bunch of services that they configured it to point to. But again, it's just a static site generator. They had to go manually add an entry for each thing they wanted to show up. But it can do some interesting things, like you can put in some API tokens, and like there's a way it can, I guess it's a little more a static site, but it's all YAML configs. Like someone had one that fetches the weather, and you can put in an API key, and it'll have one of these widgets will be your local weather. But I didn't play around with that too much. So, okay, so you've got basic Docker, Docker Compose, your network's all good, your proxy server, which is, I'm using Cloudflare, that's all, everything's happy to this point. Now we're gonna make it a little more advanced. So Caddy is a web server that by default will run everything with a TLS certificate in front of it. And one of the reasons you might want to do this, if you're, say that gap between Cloudflare and your house, so when you're connecting here, you're coming from Cloudflare into your network, you probably still want that encrypted. because you don't control Cloudflare's networks, you don't control Comcast or whoever your ISP's networks are. So you probably want that encrypted. So Caddy is going to help with that. It does automatic certificates. It'll use Let's Encrypt and a fallback to like Zero Trust, I think is the other one. But if you have this all mapped out the way I was explaining, it'll work. If you don't, you'll get rate limited by these services because it'll just keep trying to issue a cert. And there's like a maximum number of requests, like Let's Encrypt will let you do. But if you validated this step before, like I was suggesting, you should avoid that. So Caddy, this is kind of like what a Caddy config file looks like. There's like the ability to set up kind of global variables or imports, they call them. So you just basically put a name inside of parentheses in a block, and then when you want to use it, you just say import that thing. So there's a whole bunch of, you can basically just have a set of these. Think of these kind of as like server configuration on like Apache or Nginx. Very similar role for like a host. So on this one, I'm declaring the host name, and basically that's going to do, it'll match that. These rules will only apply if the request came for that domain. And then this is an extra thing I haven't talked about yet, but this is like an authentication thing. But you could do stuff like that. And then we're going to do a reverse proxy to, this is another Docker container. So I spun up a Docker container called Echo Headers. It was just to dump the headers so I could troubleshoot stuff. So Caddy is going to do that. And if you have this host name as one of the C names in Cloudflare and everything's routed correctly, the cert will get auto-generated and everything will be happy. Does that make sense? So that's the role of Caddy. It's kind of like the entry point, and it decides where everything goes and takes care of your certificates. Does that make sense? I guess that should have been up above. That's kind of like the set I played around with. That's Homer again. But I just showed it working with Caddy. So like now this is routing. I can go to this. So this is live to the internet. Does that make sense? And again, I suggest starting with something simple. There's a couple things that can go wrong with all this. So start with something simple as a recommendation there. Validate it, make sure you've got everything. Once you have it, it's rinse and repeat. Okay, so the next layer is, okay, well, I don't want everything just public to the internet. So I settled on Authelia as a way to do that. Basically, it's like an OID provider, but it works with a very simple concept. At first glance, I was like, ugh. And then where I looked at it, I was like, it's all right, whatever, I'll use it. Basically, what it's going to do is you're going to set up your user in a YAML config, and you're going to assign it different groups, email, password with the hash, all that, right? And then your Caddy file, this is what this was doing. It has this concept called forward auth, and it's basically going to do a request to this source. And if things don't match, like if it gets a 200 response from wherever it goes, it'll say, you're authorized. If it's anything but a 200 response, it'll reject it and won't do the reverse proxy. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So Caddy, one of the features of Caddy is this forward auth thing, and Authelia plays nice with it.
And Authelia, you're running that locally as well?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So, yep, so I have a Docker compose file for Authelia. It's running on port 9091 on that container. So
The forward auth is part of like Authelia, or
This is a caddy thing, but Authelia plays nice with it. So this basically says, I'm going to go to this location on that host, and if it gives me a 200 response, I'm going to assume you're allowed and proceed. If I don't get a 200 response, I'm going to abort, throw an error. That's what caddy does. And then Authelia picks up from there. So Authelia checks your session, make sure it's live. If you have any other things, it's not really configured that much on any of the setups I did. That's really all I'm doing. I'm just making sure the user's logged in. So they have to be in this config here on Authelia in order to get in. Like if you go to home.installation.zip right now, you'll hit an Authelia login because it'll just send you back. Like if it fails, it'll send you back to Authelia to log in. Does that make sense? Yeah. So you can put this in front of, I basically put this in front of everything. I put this block in. But I do it a little, you could do it as an import like this, and you can make these functional. I didn't get that far. Mine's not polished yet. But
Does this allow you to offload authentication for all of the services on
yes.
the network?
Yes, so basically you can put this block on any of these hosts in caddy, and now the internet's not allowed unless they're in that file or find some other way around it. Does that make sense?
It's a really nice interface.
Yeah. So that's kind of the role of Authelia. It's like your single sign-on, but it's not quite single sign-on, as we'll see here. Okay, so that echo headers thing I did literally just dumps out the headers that came in. And what that caddy config is going to do is it's going to inject these in. So if your app needed to know who it was, it can look at those headers to see like, hey, who are you? You're authorized. Some applications work with this. Others have their own independent auth, and you have to just log in again. And then other ones do the OID. Authelia does OID and provides the headers, or provides those values from that response. Caddy is injecting those headers. Does that make sense? A little bit complicated, but the net of all of that. One thing about headers. I could see. Yeah. So in Cloudflare, you can create a transform rule. So this is different than the other rules, but you get 10 of these as well. And basically, I'm going to take out the X forward 4 because that's what caddy uses for trust proxies. So if it came from any of those are the Cloudflare IPs. If it came from those, then we'll trust, basically we'll trust the headers that came from it. And that, if you're doing like IP restriction checks, you don't want someone to just say, hey, my X forward 4 is a trusted IP, and then just be able to bypass your check, right? So this setup in Cloudflare, I'm removing that so I can do IP checks safely. I can trust the headers by stripping them out at the Cloudflare layer. So, I mean, Cloudflare technically could inject them, but again, we start with the assumption we trust them. So Cloudflare is going to strip those from the internet, which we absolutely don't trust, and then forward it onto my network. And then same thing with the Authelia headers. This rule will take all of those headers and strip all those out too. So if you go and craft a request that says, hey, your remote email is that, and your remote user is that, and your remote groups, whatever, when it hits Cloudflare, Cloudflare will strip those out before it sends it on. Does that make sense? And that is absolutely critical if you're going to do this. You skip that step, someone knows what you're doing, they can just inject those headers, and now they're in. Does that make sense? So like I said, when I first saw it, I was like, ugh, and then I looked at it, and I was like, it's good enough for what I need. Provided you do that. Don't skip that step. Okay, so this is kind of like what my config looks like. I put a,
Sorry, on the previous screen, did they tell you to do that, or did you have to go figure that out for yourself?
there's like a little note in the Authelia thing. It's like, they're like, here's how you do this. And it's like, important, read auth headers and make sure you understand that. This is a default config. We don't assume it's secure. So they leave it up to you to kind of understand what's going on. But the net of it is, with this setup, I'm going to inject those headers in. And if those headers are there, that's who you are to that app. So you got to make sure that you trust where those came from And with my setup, that's what I did.
Yeah, and some things you use will document that, and some things will just expect you to know. The general rule is,
They kind of expect you to know with this one.
the general rule is, if your reverse proxy is adding headers that you rely on for any type of security, you should be clearing those headers from any request that comes in from the intranet.
Yes, 100%.
Yeah.
So.
Because
And validate
without
it.
this, I would not have done that.
And validate it. That's why I made that echo header server.
Yeah.
It literally just takes the request, formats it into JSON that's easy to read, and dumps it out to the screen. And then I tested it before without Caddy doing its injecting. I like went through the scenarios and made sure, okay, it's doing what it's supposed to.
Thank you.
Okay, so this is kind of what it looks like. I chose to put a different YAML file for each service that I did, just to make it easier to manage, so I don't have to scroll through a mile of YAML. So I've got all these different things. One thing that I didn't know before is you can, in your .env file, Docker Compose has a variable, forgot what it's called, but you can pull up, you can tell it what YAML files to use just in a .env file, so you don't have to like do -f with every single one. So I did that. In the .env file is just a list of all of these that I want to use, and then I can just say Docker Compose up, Docker Compose down, brings a whole stack up and down. And then I have a volumes folder right here. A lot of actually recommend you go put that at like /mnt something, whatever. I didn't like that. I like to have everything real quick and easy to view. So I did modify all the Docker Compose files to use my local volumes folder as where I want everything stored. And then I just create a matching, tried to match, some of them got messed up, but the ideal would be you match them to the config file name so you know which ones belong to which. And then similar with logs. I don't want to go hunting for those. So some of the containers have logs that you can configure where those are that are different than maybe what you get as the output from the Docker file. So it's nice to have that as well. But basically, that's the pattern that I settled on. And then over here, this one is one where I'm using Caddy. This is a Caddy config again. That top block's basically the same as what we saw before. Now I have this next thing. So this says this is a Chasm user, Chasm, whatever, I don't know. It just takes a regex. I'm not going to say that's the most efficient or best way to do that. But basically, I'm looking in that list to see Chasm users. And it can be anywhere in the list. And I would want to let them in. So if you're in that list, then now for this service, you're allowed. And if you're not, it'll just kick you back out. So you can restrict them that way with Caddy too, which I found was kind of nice. This one had its own insecure certificate, so I had to add an extra thing to tell Caddy to ignore the self-signed cert that Chasm was using. And that was me debugging. Make sure it's all happy. So is that kind of making sense? And you could, and again, once you figure it out, it's kind of rinse and repeat. It's like, okay, now I have a pattern to say this user can go to this group as well. Okay, so I'm going to skip that for a second. We'll come back. I want to look at some of the services. Any questions so far? So let's say, let's do this. Let me get logged out. Okay. So let's say I'm trying to go to one of these services. So you saw that that was a cached view, by the way. Homer has like service workers and it's a PWA, so it's like, oh, I'm still here. And then it got the actual response from the server that said, nope, you're not here. It wouldn't actually load the site. I'm just making sure. Probably don't want to do that up here, do I? I'm going to log in over here. Derp-a-derp, as soon as I can find my mouse. One sec. Okay. So now I'm authenticated for Authelia, so all those protected services, I'm now in. So what does anyone want to see? I've got a short list here. I didn't really have a ton of time to figure this out, but these are the ones that I chose to play with. Jellyfin. It's probably the least interesting one. I threw some ebooks in here. So this is one that kind of has that problem I was saying. This one's not made to work with Authelia. It might have a way to do it, but I didn't get that far, right? So every application may or may not play nice. My problem is I'm using the same host name for everything. So no, I've just got.
I have a stand device that has a bunch of movies on it. I've been meaning
I didn't put movies. I just have books. There's nothing.
Like I've been meaning to do something like this for my home network, and so I was like, that one looks like something I'd use.
So Jellyfin does like movies, images, and ebooks, right? So this is I think this was a PDF originally. You can just come in here and it'll remember your place. So when you close it, you come back later.
Nice.
So that's all I did with Jellyfin was the books. I didn't play around with it very long. I just got it working, threw some stuff in, was like, it works. All right, next one. Yeah, they have an audio. This supports audiobooks too. Yes. Yes, Jellyfin does. Jellyfin does like ebooks, audiobooks, movies, shows, that kind of stuff. All right, that's Jellyfin. Anything else?
About the VS Code one,
VS Code is kind of cool. So VS Code, you can set up a volume and mount it. It is only single user. That's not VS Code. Did I click on the wrong one? Or? I just didn't change the link.
Quick question. Why do you want to store your stuff on like audiobooks, videos, that
So
service?
my intention with the books specifically is I can use them from any device and keep track of where I was and know if I finished it or not, which Jellyfin does. So it's kind of like what Kindle does, but like instead of having to use Amazon service, you just run your own.
And if you have a lot of stuff that's all on your home server instead of on whatever device you're in, so you could have them as long as you have internet.
Yeah, one of the reasons, like say Amazon's got a pretty good track record as far as a lot of services go of keeping things around and not like, hey, we changed the format, now you got to rebuild your whole library. But it's not to say they won't do that. So part of my interest is I want to own it myself so that if it goes away, I still have it, like for stuff that I care about. So I mean, like the worst I've seen with Amazon is like someone takes a movie, like you buy a video from Amazon and then they take it out of your library.
Yeah.
That does happen.
Yeah, they just decide we're not carrying this anymore. Even
Right.
though you paid $20 for it.
You just have a license to it.
Yeah.
Whereas with some of the other sources where you buy it, you actually have a physical copy. So having somewhere that you manage that and you can control that, I think is an advantage for the consumer. That's why I'm interested in it personally. But your interest might vary. I wanted to go to code. I just had the wrong URL on that. Homer YAML code. Single user. So this has a volume that's shared, so this is persistent. I just tested that. I even installed some things. I threw Dino in there to see like, all right, can I install stuff? Yep, it's still here when I come back later. So it's just running on that container and then has a shared volume, and that's your file system. But it's basically what you expect. There are some plugins that don't work. Things like if I want to host a web server isn't going to work with the way I have it set up currently. I could figure that out, but like I'm not forwarding arbitrary ports in through my network, so like I can't just run something. It has to go into that caddy file or you can't access it in my setup. So it's not, I could make a designated one for this purpose and have it route to this guy and then just always run it on that port. I just didn't do that yet. But it works kind of how you'd expect VS Code 2. You can install extensions. Some work, some don't. I played around with it for like 15 minutes. I was like, all right, looks good, looks interesting. I'll come back to this later. Because I'm just kind of kicking the tires right now on a lot of these. All right, what else? Anyone want to see anything else? Or Tunneler? So this one's the fun one. Let me pause on that. I'll do that one last.
Okay.
As I click on it. I'll show Mattermost. So there's another layer of this. This one has an auto login. But you have to be a paying customer. So who's familiar with Mattermost? Anyone? It's basically like Slack and Asana and GitHub Actions combined. Probably the best way to say it. But it's a premium thing, or freemium. So they have an open source thing, but you can't use a bunch of features unless you're a paying customer. But it's self-hosted, like you run it yourself. So it's like, think of Slack or any of these things. You run it on your own infrastructure, but you still pay them a license for certain features. So I didn't even know what it was before. I just played around with it. It looked interesting. Yeah. Oh, man. I might have locked myself out. Maybe we won't see this. I wanted to show one thing. It's not going to work. Email. What did I do? It's not going to let me in. Okay, I can't show that. Sorry. It is like Slack, and it has webhooks and bots and all that. And I did install an uptime monitor. And this guy has a bot that can post, and I configured that to go to Mattermost, if that makes sense. So it would tell me when things were down. This one's Uptime Kuma. Seemed pretty good for like a one caveat with this: if you're running things like I am, you need to use like the internal stuff, because Authelia, everything's going to redirect to that, and it's going to look like everything's up. So you have to have some way of doing it internal, which may or may not have implications for security. Do you want all your hosts to be able to see each other? Didn't figure all that out yet. But an uptime monitor might be something you want to do there. This one looked pretty good. I've got this one. This one works better for monitoring just TCP ports, because that's more direct. There's no Authelia in the middle. So it'll tell me if my servers are all up. And this has an admin. These are the status pages. Not integrated. Kuma. Hopefully this one's good. Yep. So you can just add as many monitors as you want. It's got things like, so you can do different notification setups. Tell it how many retries you want to do, warn you if a cert's about to expire, stuff like that. And then when you're in the config for a notification, so there's the webhook to the Mattermost. And again, to not be affected by Authelia, I have to use the internal stuff. So Caddy's not in the middle of that. But yeah, that's Kuma. Uptime monitoring seemed pretty good. And then Chasm. I did want to show this one. So this one is the one that's integrated. You saw that it went to the login page, but then it sent me back to Authelia because it has a single sign-in that I actually went and integrated. So this is what it can look like with an app that actually supports it. Something that Authelia can do. Where is my auth? This guy, one-time password, right there. It does support two-factor, and you can enable that on services. You can tell the service, hey, Authelia, I need two-factor for this service. So you can, so I set this one up. This is basically Docker container. Is Docker inside a Docker? Running desktop apps. And then streaming through like VNC, I think. Anyway. So let's say, sure, I want to run GIMP. That'll spin up a container on Chasm. So Chasm is itself a Docker container. And then that request says, launch this other container inside of that container. And you can do things that normally, like that don't have a web interface. So basically, if you can Dockerize it, you can get it in here, maybe. Sometimes it's having a few issues. I'm not sure if it just timed out or if it's not going to work. I did get this working. I thought it was a pretty interesting use case for something like this. About half the apps I tried worked. The other half didn't. I did have this one working last night, though. I'm not sure it's going to play nice today. Let's try a different one. Maybe they're all broke. There's also a thing you can do where you can enable a persistent profile. So basically, that just gives it a dedicated file space to keep. If you don't do that, it'll just throw it away every time. It just treats it like the default is everything's ephemeral in this. So you just spin up a browser, do whatever you want, and when you come back in, everything's cleared. You don't have to worry about like getting a virus or anything. It's like its own isolated container. It'll spin it up, you do what you want, and then it'll burn down, throw it away when it's done. So like you wouldn't, like if you got a virus, it was in that container, unless it did a container escape, but then you got a different problem. But, any questions with Chasm while this is trying to load? Maybe it'll load.
It is funny, you have Brave and Firefox and Chrome there, Edge. It's a yo-dog thing, right? I heard you liked containers and browsers, so we're running a container in a container so you can run a browser in a browser.
Yep, that is exactly what it is. But actually, part of the reason I did that was I don't have all those browsers installed, and being a web developer, a lot of times you need to sometimes check things, and just having it on hand was the idea. But I don't know why it's not working today. This was working last night. I got to look at a log file and figure out what's going on there. So it doesn't look like that's going to play nice, unfortunately. I was hoping, I tried like all these. I'm not sure. Give one more shot, and then we'll move on. Okay, so any questions with all this? Is this kind of making sense?
Yeah.
Is this interesting? This has been on my list for a long time, so, but then the presentation came up and I was up till like 5 a.m. trying to figure some of these out. So. Nope, and apparently I didn't figure this one out. So
what's the user management in Filio like?
it's just that YAML file.
So you do have to edit the YAML file to add any users?
You can set up a database if you want. Their default is that YAML file. So you just hash the password, and then that's your database. All right, tunneler. We'll get to this last one here. So one of the other use cases that I thought of, but I'm not sure I have the solution I want. That's not what I want. Tunneler. What did I click on?
Stop helping me, browser.
For real. I want that. So one of the use cases is game servers, right? And same kind of idea. How do you run a game server without publishing your IP? That was the goal. And I have a solution. I'm not going to say this is what I'm going to stick with or what I'd recommend, but I can show you what I did. It's using Cloudflare again. I do have some slides for this that we skipped over. So it's using Cloudflare. They have this thing called zero auth. And inside of zero auth is a thing called tunnels, hence the name tunneler. And what a tunnel lets you do is you run the client on both ends. So on my server, I download and I install Cloudflare, which is their CLI application. And I connect to Cloudflare with the configuration, which okay. So there's my example. This is the configuration that I used. So you create a tunnel, you give it the ID, it generates a service account that has like a secret and its own ID. That's what that credentials file is. That allows you to basically say, hey, I want this connection, and it's authorized with Cloudflare, right? And then you create these ingress rules. So I'm saying anything to this host name, I want you to map to TCP that on wherever I launched this from. Does that make sense? Now, one thing to note is this is going to come into Cloudflare on port 443. So when I connect to it, I'm going to, like on, say, my laptop, it's going to, my network is just going to see an external request to that host name, port 443. And then on my side, I'm going to connect to that same tunnel, and it's going to create a local port forwarding rule that will map whatever port I want to just use that connection. But external, they just see traffic going out port 443 to Cloudflare. So basically, I'm running Minecraft over an HTTPS tunnel, which probably will get around a lot of firewalls. So. Which was kind of the goal. We want to the other end, and I want to have a restricted way to do it. And like you said, if someone got those zone files or whatever, they could figure it out. But basically, I could just switch them and have a way to use the CNAME as a soft authentication to get into my game server. Only people that have that will get routed to me. No one else will route to me unless they try connecting to Cloudflare with that IP. And they do have to have the tunnel on the other end because I'm not running a browser on that port. So you can't just connect to it directly. You do have to run the client on both ends because it's like Cloudflare will respond like, denied, some kind of an error. Some kind of an error request, but if you run the tunnel there, then it's like, oh, I know what you're trying to do, and it'll route the traffic for you. And this was...
So you set up a Minecraft server on your home server, you're routing it to Cloudflare, and then for other people to connect, they have to run some tunneling software?
Yep, so they download this gametunneler.exe file, and then all that is a wrapper for Cloudflare that is pre-configured for my host names. So they just launch it, and they don't know or care what's going on. They just know they have to have that tunnel running. So that's the final demo.
It's just like SSH tunneling on both sides.
Yep.
And you have a broker in the middle.
Yep. If you want to connect, Jack. So let me... And this is one of the reasons why you might want Cloudflare to be in control of this, because this is all happening with software. So it's doing all kinds of dynamic, fun stuff, rerouting things on the fly. You can even do it with the free one. I actually found it was a little easier to do the free one. If you don't even create a Cloudflare account, you can download Cloudflare, the CLI, spawn a tunnel from wherever you're hosting the server. It'll give you a random host name, and then you just share that host name, and then they do the same connection over here, and you don't even have to sign up. Like, they just let you do it for free. It's kind of like ng-rock and some of those other things where you can just spin it up and punch out through, let people get in. So they're called reverse tunnels. That's what you're doing. So, tunneler. My use case was trying to run a game server. What am I trying to do? I'm trying to share screen because I can't look over my shoulder. Duplicate. That's what I didn't want. Okay, so let's say I'm interested in all right, so I go to Tunneler, I get my game tunnel. I already have it, but whatever. I launch it. Oh, maybe now it's not going to play nice, is it? I'm going to do it in terminal so I can see what the error is. No, it worked. I don't know what happened. It's supposed to just do that. So now I have a connection to, so basically localhost 25565, which is the default port for Minecraft, is going to that ESXi server, which is running a Minecraft server, which also has the other end of the tunnel.
Okay.
That's what's going on.
So at this point, you just start Minecraft.
Yep, now I just launched Minecraft, and you're connected, right? He was helping me test this. We did this with Minecraft and Terraria. It works with TCP easier. It does say it works with UDP. I tried it for a little bit. I wasn't able to quite figure out how to get the UDP stuff happy. They say it works. If you check the right box, there's like a box you have to check. And then there was this Minecraft admin thing I was trying to use, but it didn't support, like it was like 2 years old. But their idea was it would run it all in Docker, similar to what we're doing, but it would be running a Python script that would listen on those ports for a connection. And then when someone tried to connect, then it would spin up the server. So it's not running the server all the time. And I was like, that's what I want in the final form. But I didn't get that far yet. So now I just go direct connection to localhost.
That's awesome.
He's playing on this computer. We're both on Bridgerland's Wi-Fi, public Wi-Fi, connecting to our house through this tunnel. So, and again, the egress, like if you're looking at the firewall or anything, it would just look like we're both sending port 443 requests out.
Oh, it worked. I did a long time ago. This is back in the early 2000s. I was working for a bank, and they had everything locked down. Like you couldn't even search for like basic internet articles for like development software. So I did the kind of similar thing with the reverse proxy. So I would just send a request, use SSH. I would send a request from work and go to my home server. The home server would make the request, and then just send the website back to me. This is pretty cool.
Yep. And what are you going to do about that? Block Cloudflare?
Yeah.
Good luck. Probably runs what, like 20% of the internet now is the stat I saw.
So it's not like they can see the traffic with Minecraft.
Yeah, no, they can't. It's going through an encrypted tunnel.
Yep.
You might be able to get some heuristics to see like packet sizes or something, but like this is not normal HTTP traffic. But other than that, like, what are you gonna do? Okay, so that's pretty much it. Oh, one thing with this script, I did play around with it. I have the ability to run Minecraft or Terraria. It defaults to the Minecraft one, and I can choose which server. So I could say Minecraft MC2. Now that same tunnel, so it kicked me out because I dropped the tunnel. I joined this, so you're still in the game, right? So now I'm on a completely different server because I just switched which tunnel I'm using.
And so you set it up in Cloudflare, and then they gave you the executable? Like it was
They have, so the simple thing is this. If you do it manually, you just point it at the host name that's configured for the tunnel.
Yeah.
I just made a wrapper that gives a CLI so you can just choose which one, and then they're just hard-coded in here right now. In my head, I was like, eventually I'll make it so it only gives them the host name for the ones they want, because like my use case on this is like I got like 40 nieces and nephews, and they all want to play, but then they start playing, they're like, now we want to do it with their friends, but some of those parents don't want like random kids they don't know playing with their kids. So it's like, how do we deal with this? So that's kind of my use case of why I'm trying to figure this out. I could just give them something, and then they log in, and it's like, here's the host you can connect to. That's my end goal, what I'm wanting to do.
So that's just like to filter who you want to play games.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
Yeah, because some of them don't care, and some are like, no, only with family.
Yeah.
So the only family ones, I got to make sure don't go. I never give those host names to the friend ones. I was like, how do I deal with that in a sane way? That's what I'm working on. I don't have that figured out yet, but I'm trying to figure out if anyone has any better ideas. I tried it with WireGuard and some other stuff, with the VPN as well. that one, the WireGuard client has to be run as an administrator, which some of these same parents won't let them run as admin. This you can do as a local user. You don't have to install anything. You can just grab that Cloudflare exe, grab the tunneler, and you're up and running. Because it's all just local. And it's outbound 443. So it's like, if you could talk to the internet, this will work. For better or worse. Now, if they learn what else this can do, it might cause other issues for this. But anyway, that's what I got prepared. Any questions, feedback?
That's pretty cool, man.
That's cool. I just had one for like on the business side of it, right there, like the main things you use it is to protect your stuff, database stuff, client information.
I mean, you could run, so I'm probably going to try running an actual website this way, is the next thing. Right now, I don't have anything production, but it basically makes it so you can just be your own, like your own host for the internet, for internet connected services. That's my goal. And a lot of it is just internal, just I want to be able to use it wherever I'm at for myself. But I do want to try, like I'll probably spin up another virtual machine, create a different host name, set up those routing rules and all that stuff, and then try it with an actual site that's not like trying to be locked down. But most of the stuff I've done today is trying to be locked down because it's just for me and people I want to share it with. It's not for the internet. That's the current use case. Most stuff I was showing you today is kind of like set up that way, where it's like, this is just for people that I want to share it to. Yeah. But you don't have to do that. That's part of the cool thing about all this is like, your home network can be part of the internet. Now, hopefully, it's only the part of your home network you want to be part of the internet is part of the internet. That's the goal. So. Cool. Anything else anyone want to see? Oh, I did take this snapshot. This was me just playing around with it for like a day. Game servers, Minecraft probably uses like 100 megs per hour per connected client. So may or may not be an issue. Cloudflare says bandwidth is free. I don't know what the limit of that is. There's no pricing, but they have like an acceptable use policy. I looked through it. It didn't say you can't run a game server this way. Most of the things they're worried about seem to be more malicious uses. But I don't know. That's what 24 hours looks like. So, all right. Anything else? Or that's all I got. We're still looking for the presentation next month. Bill's the backup